Excellent. Okay, welcome to the Hot Topic Climate Sessions number 2. So this session is on urban adaptation with Heba from the Charter Cities Institute and Olamide from the Lagos Urban Development Initiative. As a quick reminder, what are the Hot Topic Climate Sessions? So these are conversations to explore the intersection of climate action, research, advocacy and data, and the power of open geospatial data and community mapping. So that's our kind of broad frame. Who are the experts in the room? So every session we have 2 experts come and join us who have some kind of expertise in climate action. And today we have Heba Elhanafy. She's an urban researcher at the Charter Cities Institute, and Olamide Ejorh, who is the executive director at the Lagos Urban Development Initiative. So this conversation will explore adaptation to climate change through the lens of urban development that centers on neighborhoods, communities, and the needs and behaviors of people within them. I'm going to introduce our guests for a couple of minutes, so bear with me. Heba is an architect, urban planner, developer, and researcher with an interest in how history intersects with the future of urban settlements. She has degrees in architecture and urban planning and urban development. She's been at the Charter Cities Institute for 4 years as an urban researcher and is now launching the Africa Urban Lab at East Africa's first Africa School of Economics in Zanzibar, where there is currently an internet outage. So if we lose Heba for any reason, that might be why. Just so you know, charter cities are new cities granted special jurisdiction for new governance systems and policy reforms. And one such city called Etana can be found just outside of Lagos, which is a nice segue to Olamide. So Olamide is an urban activist, project manager, researcher, filmmaker, and writer. She's involved in governance and social issues within the urban environment of Lagos and is an advocate for sustainable transportation and social engagement within urban spaces. Her work has a strong focus on urban planning that is participatory from inception through to maintenance. 7 years ago, she founded the Lagos Urban Development Initiative, which uses project work, engagement, and research to bring people together around a more inclusive, livable, and sustainable Lagos. Now, there are probably many interesting overlaps that we could explore with these 2 guests, but the one that actually brought us together is walkability and the walkabilities of cities. So we're going to start there. So I'm now going to hand over to Heba to give us a 6-minute deep dive, if that's not an oxymoron, into walking the unwalkable in Lusaka, Zambia. So over to you, Heba.
Yes, well, thanks, Pete. Yeah, so I'm gonna today be talking about walking the unwalkable. If you can move the slide. So walking the unwalkable is part of the Lusaka Urban Lab, with an initiative that we started in Lusaka. We have an office, we have a regional office there, and practically the whole idea is to bring Zambia or bring Lusaka to the forefront of research in the Southern African region. We know there are a lot of research that comes out of Joburg, a lot of research that comes out of Cape Town, with cities like Harare or Lusaka are a little bit on the backside. So yeah, this is one of the projects that we worked on last year. If the slide can move, would be great. So yeah, a little bit of background on walkability in general. So first off, we look at the numbers. We find that 78% of people use walk to get to one place or to travel on the continent. This is one of the highest numbers in the world. Zambia in itself has also a very high walking number. So you have a 55-minute per day on average that people spend walking. And Lusaka specifically, if we look at these numbers, we find that 65% of the daily trips are done by walking. So the majority of the daily trips are done by walking. But that doesn't really mean that Lusaka is walkable. So people walk out of necessity, out of need, out of the fact that they can't afford public transportation or the lack of public transportation. But that doesn't mean that the environment is great for walking. So we find that 60% of the road traffic accidents, the target of that is a Mediterranean. 75% of all the roads don't exist, of all sidewalks don't exist in Zambia. And there is always a question about like where are the street lights and where are the traffic symbols. They just simply don't exist. If we move to the next slide, we also look at Lusaka from a very urban perspective, not from an infrastructure perspective. And we found Lusaka to be an extremely low dense yet crowded city. So Lusaka kind of expands outwards rather than expanding upwards. There is practically, and this is a big claim, but we can practically claim there are no mixed-use neighborhoods whatsoever. And as I explained in the beginning, it's extremely sprawled, which all affects the walkability, and that's why we see higher numbers when it comes to walking. Pete? Yeah, those are pictures from some of the best neighborhoods and best streets in Lusaka. There are actually no sidewalks, there are no streetlights, there are no nothing. And here's a picture of me on the top right, where I fell into a mud hole in the beautiful streets of Lusaka, as I was exploring early stages of the project. So yeah, so the whole idea of the project is 4 walks that we do with different people from the community, from the government, and from the civil society, to bring them together to discuss the issues of walking. And those are also directed routes that we kind of also co-chose together. If we go to the next slide. Yeah, so practically what we did is that we started with a co-design workshop. So we brought all of the stakeholders together. We're like, okay, here is the problem, what can we do? From there, we designed the 4 routes that we're going to take around the routes that Lusakans choose on everyday basis. And then we used, as I'm going to show, transit walking and mapping to do actually those things, and use participatory policy making and development to produce the final outcome of the 9-month project. I think, yes. So yeah, so practically the whole idea of the project is to understand and map walkability, but it's also to have empirical evidence of those walkability challenges in Lusaka, and mix that with the experience of the everyday walker. So we have a lot of numbers on sidewalks that are missing, but what does that mean in practice? And one of the things that means in practice that I fall into mud holes, right? And to generate evidence-based policy solutions for walkability, and most importantly, to bring those people together, the policymakers who always drive cars, and the people who always walk in the streets, and the students who are studying planning, to bring them on one table and have this discussion that startup. If we move to the next slide. Yeah, so this is what we practically did. We walked, everyone had a map with their hands, and they mapped individually, and then we did co-mapping exercise that lasted from 60 to 90 minutes. So we brought all of this like outcomes on one big map. And if you go to the next slides, we can see some of those outcomes. Yeah, so those are kind of like the individual maps. For every walk, we would have an individual map where the participant would fill. And then the second thing is kind of like the co-map that we bring together. And then the third thing is the kind of final outcomes. So if you actually want to go into the details of the final outcomes, yeah, on our website, churchresinstitute.com /Lusaka Urban Lab, you're gonna easily access this. This goes into a details of the last workshop that we did, which was a 3-day workshop where we sat together, looked at all the maps we've done over 9 months, and tried to kind of like assimilate it into some sort of a policy brief. And we presented the policy brief to the Ministry of Local Government right before they were starting the national plan, or the national spatial plan for Zambia and for Lusaka specifically. And hopefully once they present that plan, those kind of policy recommendations, we can see them. I hope I stayed under the time. Thank you, and we'll talk a lot more about this. This is kind of like what we did on a very high scale. Thank you, Meet.
Thank you, Heba. Perfect timing. And while you are digesting that, we'll throw some more information in from Olamide. So the Lagos Urban Development Initiative has been, well, very recently, maybe it's still current as a project, but developing walkability assessments in 4 of the city's neighbourhoods. So Olamide, your 6 minutes starts now, and then we'll go into conversation.
Great. Thank you, Pete. We can go to the first slide. I'm also going to try and rush through all of this as well within 6 minutes. So yeah, we'll go to the next slide. So just to start that, in Lagos, there's about 52% of households that do not own cars, and it's reported that 80% of all daily trips are made by public transport, which also includes walking. And so, even though we are also an oil-producing country, but we don't refine oil, so petrol is very expensive. And also we've just recently removed the subsidy on petrol, so therefore it's very expensive to have a car and to move around the city, even with public transport. And so I think last year, a lot of people have been moving away from even driving their cars to thinking about how they can walk more, use public transport, and even cycle more, which is, it's a long way because it's not the high percentage of people, but at least 80% of trips are made from walking. However, the infrastructure is not great. I think if you can see in the pictures on the side, people who are walking, we're all competing with kind of like public transport, with selling things on the side of the road, we're crossing the roads on a kind of high speed dual carriageways. The road infrastructure itself is not even great itself, potholes and also kind of drainage systems are open. So there's quite a lot of infrastructure challenges when it comes to walking. As well as just accessibility challenges. So imagine if also you're buying goods from the market, how do you move? How do you walk around? How do you move your goods around? Also, thinking about things like water, moving, because water isn't always available, especially in these kind of situations, how you're moving those things. So there's a lot of things that are being moved via our feet or carried, but therefore there isn't a good enough infrastructure. And so, people are really kind of competing with the infrastructure, with the traffic as well. And so we at Ludi, over the years, we've been advocating for more accessible and reliable public transport, as well as NMT. And so last year, go to the next slide. So last year, we did 5 walkability assessments in different areas with community members. And at University of Lagos, we did that with students. And we basically used the ITDP, the Institute of Transportation and Development Policy walking assessment in these 5 areas. And unfortunately, there isn't substantial data on walking or cycling. And when we do go to ministries to talk about NMT infrastructure and so on, they ask us questions. So how many people are cycling? Where are people cycling from and to? Things like this, but we don't have the data. And so when we're talking about advocacy, we kind of need kind of strong data, especially when we're going to government officials to say we need this in these sites or in these communities or in these places. So we did these walkability assessments, and really for also to put the data collection ability within the hands of the community. So they also have the data to go and advocate for these things themselves. And so go to the next slide. So these are the indicators that we used. The ITDP assessment is online, so everybody used a phone. There's also a paper one, which we printed for those who don't have phones. And then what we then did was aggregate all that data. There were about 15, each walk we had about 15 to 20 people doing the walks, and then we aggregated the data, and then there were percentages. So the indicators, and as you can see, 11 indicators, like, walkways, talks about the size of the walkways, what type of walkways, crosswalks, how far are the crosswalks away from each other? Are they safe? Is there clear markings? I don't want to go through all of this, but there's a variety of different indicators to support the assessment. So we go to the next slide. Yeah, so then this is kind of what it looks like at the end. And then there's a bit of an explanation of what all of these mean. And so it's a percentage. So how good are the small blocks in the community? What's the driveway density? Is there connectivity? So how are we connecting with other public transport? And then physically permeable frontage, walkways, shade and shelter. And shade and shelter becomes quite important because the kind of rain that you get in this kind of tropics cities or countries, it's like it's beating you. They're being attacked by the rain, but also by the sun, because if there's no shade for that, walking then becomes a lot more tasking than if you're in a kind of cooler environment. And then, and 1 minute left. Okay, that's fine. So we aggregated all this data manually. So I would say like just two things to say now, the positives and maybe the negatives, or what we could wish for within these kind of assessments. So we aggregated all this data manually, but what worked well is that there's already a criteria that can be used for a variety of different areas in Lagos. So so that there is a possibility of comparison. But however, because it's not automated, you have to do that kind of manually. So I think that's where the gap is. Have to do this manually, aggregate all the data, and then then you have a report at the end. But what would be great is to kind of have something where even the government agencies can kind of log on and see this is what's happening in this place in Lagos, or in this place in Lagos, and this is where we need to kind of fill in the gaps in terms of walkability. So I think that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, Olamide, you did excellent, because I know you had many more slides. Well adapted. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, because we're going to talk about this for a bit. So thanks a million to both of you for framing that with real project work. This is a hot topic climate session, so it'd be interesting to know from both of you. In fact, I'm going to ask you two questions simultaneously. Interesting to know for both of you, why does this matter in terms of climate adaptation, particularly? And what are people walking from and to in general? So maybe Heba, you want to go first, and then we can pass it over to Olamide.
Yeah. So we see now, like, all the major walks, or what the literature tells us about walkability, right? Like, it's an inherently a good thing for the environment. Less gas, less CO2 emissions, better for your health, all these kind of things. So we have the literature on our side, and like, you also have the public perception of walkability. Like, this project was done through with many like government officials, and you walk in the door and they're like, hey, we're working on walkability, and they're like, yeah, of course, walkability is great, let's all walk together. Will that really be reflected in policy? That's another question. But that being said, right, so we have now a population that is walking, but we also have a huge rapid increase in urbanization all over sub-Saharan Africa. So we're as we're planning right now, we're not just planning the cities, we're planning the future freaking cities, right? So we're at a crossroads whether this population is gonna continue walking or is gonna continue using private cars. I say that all the time in Lusaka, people, before they buy their house or before they pay for their kids' education, move them to a better school, they buy a car. The first thing that you do once you have a little bit of money is that you buy a car, because public transportation is that bad, and like walking is just it's insane. Like, it's at least 60 minutes one way, and then you go to work and you're dying. So that's why it's practically very important for climate, because I mean, we have the data, we know walkability is good for climate, and we know that people are walking now. We just want to make sure that in the future they will continue walking, and that's why we need to focus on that. We need to have more data, we need to understand like the experience of walking, we need to have measurements, all these kind of things. And that's why I kind of where the urgency of the project kind of started in Lusaka, actually, with this.
Cool. Olamide, feel free to respond to the same question, but I'm also going to pick out something from Heba's response that maybe you want to comment on, that gap between perception from those that could make changes to improve this and the actual practice in terms of policy or investment, and how that plays out in Lagos.
Great. Yeah. So maybe I'll, because I think Heba's kind of touched on the climate aspect. So maybe I'll talk a little about the gap in terms of maybe perception of walkability. So, yeah, everyone is walking. I think Heba has made that clear. The majority of people are walking. But however, the people who are making the kind of the policies are not necessarily walking. They're kind of, in their big cars. So they're completely taken away from that side of how people are living within the city. And so therefore, when policies are being made, or when, decisions are being made around walkability, around transportation, it kind of focuses more on the car, or at least on the road infrastructure. And the example of Lagos is we don't have a lot of roads, but we have roads, and a lot of the roads, majority of the roads don't have sidewalks. So we have some really great roads and very high-speed roads even, which are constantly being fixed. So money is going into to them. But then there is a lack of money or going into the infrastructure of walking. And I'm going to put cycling in there because I'm an advocate for cycling too. But LMT in general, the budgets seem to kind of stand with the road infrastructure and not the walking infrastructure, and also is taking away from the public transport infrastructure, which I think is where kind of more of the budgetary and policy alignments need to go towards, because we, as I've mentioned, price of petrol is going up, and this is global, not just in Lagos, and also it's expensive, and a lot of people, especially in Nigeria, can't afford it. And even public transport is going up because of the cost of petrol. So we really need to move as governments, as policymakers, move our thinking into that direction.
Yeah, and just adding on Olamide's point as well. There is another also like huge, that the biggest gap I see also is the informal settlements, right? Most of sub-Saharan or African cities in general, 70% of that is quote unquote informal settlements. And walkability there, that's a whole different issue. And Olamide, as you explained in your presentation, right, when it rains, right? When it rains, it rains. And that causes a lot of flooding. I know, like right now, Nairobi is also having really bad floods. The island has been having floods. I mean, it's easier a little bit on the island, but it had floods a couple of weeks back. And walkability in some of the findings that we found in the research, like walkability in informal settlement, that's a whole different. It doesn't really talk in the normal terms that we use for like sidewalks, lighting, all these kind of things are completely different. It's a different game when we go there, and this is one of the biggest gap, because like we had a PS for the Ministry of Local Government work with us, one of the works that we did in the informal settlements, and he was just like talking about sidewalks, and the street all in all it's like 3 meters, and it's there is no cars. Or like, why do we need sidewalks if there is no cars in the informal settlement? So it's needing to like kind of redefine and close that gap of what is actually needed, or what we studied in school, or what we think is needed for walkability as well. And that applies to like 70%, the majority of our cities. So that's also another like huge gap that at least we found in our work.
Okay, cool. And just a prompt for our audience then. In a few minutes, we're going to open up for a discussion with the audience. So when you're hearing Heba and Olamide's points here, like I'd like to think about what role could open mapping play here. What would we need to, as a movement, what would we need to mobilize people towards in order to contribute to this as a use case, and what experience do we already have that is relevant or applicable to this topic? And just to like tee that up, the next question for you both is, how does geospatial data figure? Like, we know it can provide a way of communicating the reality of someone. For them to choose what they map is a way of presenting their own reality. How does geospatial data figure in the work you're doing, and what data are you finding isn't available, and where it isn't, what's the blockers? Like, how could that be resolved? So maybe Olamide, do you want to take this one first?
Sure. So in terms of geospatial data, I think what is important, what it shows is where maybe there are some gaps, or where there are some needed, I'm going to stick to infrastructure, but needed infrastructure, or needs of the people, the communities, and that can be then communicated to a vast majority, or vast numbers of people, whether it's government officials, local government, or even people within the community themselves. Then in terms of, I think the second question was, what was the second question again now?
The second question was, what data is and isn't available to you in Lagos, and what are the blockers? Like, why can't you get hold of the data you need?
Yeah, so what data is not available? So I think there's a lot of data not available in Lagos. I had a conversation recently with some others from your team, even about kind of mapping public mapping informal public transport. And the fact that, you know, there is some data on it, but it's so limited. And then how do we even, we've mapped it, but of course the data becomes kind of insignificant. It needs to be constantly kind of collected, because it's informal and it's not something that is following a trajectory of every day. The weather influences how people move. You know, the petrol price influences how informal transport moves, and the cost of informal transport. And then Heba mentioned something as well. The informal settlements, a lot of them are not mapped. I mean, most of, you know, African countries are not mapped anyway to the detail. But then, you know, it's even worse when you go to these kind of settlements that are really dense. And no one's really kind of mapping them, because they're not the formal areas. Though they are, it's because, I mean, 70 to 80% of the population are living in them, so they are the formal. They're actually not the informal, you know. So so they do also need to be mapped, and I think that's one area that I think is really lacking. But I think it's really this idea of, you know, when even thinking about public transport and bus stops, sorry, informal public transport and bus stops, you know, where are the bus stops? Nobody knows. Is it just, you know, are there, I mean, and the thing is that we don't know, we don't necessarily know, because we don't use it, but those who do use it every day know where to stand to pick up the bus, or know where to go to stop the bus, and know which routes they have to take to get from A to B, or if that one isn't working, they know how to change from this other route. And so it's really about trying to understand those systems, and trying to get the data from those systems, so that it can be kind of explored more, supported more, because it's not about taking it away, but it's about how can we make this, how can we support these areas more.
Okay, interesting balance between formal and informal in terms of settlements and transport. Heba, maybe you'd like to add something, and then we'll open up to comments. And I'm going to ask Michael from the HOTS Open Mapping Hub in Eastern Southern Africa to give the first comment. Everybody else, if you start putting your hands up, I will try and get to you in order. So Heba, over to you.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Olamide practically covered most of the points I wanted to cover. I think the only thing that I would add is also like the attitudes that mapping comes in, right? There is a tendency when we talk about walkability to map sidewalks, to like focus a little bit more on the infrastructure, and it's usually like the infrastructure that is surrounded or like it's protecting for cars, right? So when we talk about sidewalk, it's like we're creating this little space for a person to walk, so the car can take the rest of the space. While we, as we said, when we go to the informal settlements, well, there is not that many cars, and the street is practically way more safer because it's a shared street. Everyone is just like walking and doing all these kind of things. So the attitude when it comes to mapping, we have a lot of, not a lot in Africa, but generally in the world, we have a lot of data sets on walkability, but it also comes to, it's somehow like car-centric walkability measures, which I always find kind of like funny in itself. It's like, oh, we're looking at the infrastructure that is protecting us from the car, but it's centering the car. So everything is around the car still. So kind of like the attitudes towards mapping what is walkability actually, and like redefining what is walkability and what is the walking experience, and what does a shared street mean, and like the innovation that are done in informal settlement when it comes to walkability, and how people mitigate the space with the cars, with the bicycles, and these kind of things. I, at least in my project, I found it extremely kind of hard to quantify and map, and put it on a map. And policymakers, they freaking love maps. So I just kind of like, at the end of the day, you have to put everything on a map. But like, how do I put mitigation of space on a map, and this like on a quantitative map kind of. So yeah, so I think that would be my kind of addition to what I think Olamide covered everything.
I think you may have come up with HOT's next slogan: "We freaking love maps." I think that's a good one. Olamide, thank you. Your role is not over, but I will unpin you now, because people can ask you questions, but people can also bring their own experience to bear on the subject. If either of you wants to put your hand up and like comment on someone else, like please feel free. Michael, are you here?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I'm going to just unpin myself and you should magically appear on stage. There we go. Feel free to turn your camera on, Michael, and go for it.
Yeah, unfortunately, I won't turn on my camera. We are experiencing some intermittent internet connection here in Nairobi. So just to conserve some bandwidth. Yes, so thank you so much, Heba and Olamide, for the nice presentation on walkability. This is so timely because here at the Eastern and Southern African Hub, we are implementing a program dubbed Climate Ready Cities in 3 cities: DRC, Kinshasa, Nairobi, Kenya, and Addis Ababa. And one of the things that we are really looking at is to increase the adoption of open map data and tools by stakeholders in these cities in addressing local climate-related challenges, including walkability. For us here, we are calling it the 15-minute city concept, a concept that was developed by a professor from Sorbonne University, Paris, called Carlos Moreno. So here, what we are really trying to look at is trying to model if in these cities, communities are within 15 minutes to access of local amenities, including healthcare facilities, education, schools, with an aim of them using this as an a climate adoption measure. So one of the questions that I would want to pose to you, Heba and Olamide, while you're modeling walkability in the cities of Lagos and Lusaka, have you ever come across any model, any opportunity cost model that says by communities adopting to use clean ways of transportation, such as walking or using bikes, that this is the percentage that carbon emissions will be reduced by either vehicular emission by using buses, public transport, or private transport? Have you ever come across any methodology that points to that? Because at the same time, while we are really championing for people to walk to such critical services, we also need to show evidence of the amount of carbon emissions that we are safeguarding the environment from. Yes, please.
Okay, so Heba and Olamide, you need to write down that question because we're going to take comments from Jose and Kirsten first, and then we'll come back to you. So, Jose, in fact, I introduced Michael, but please, everybody, introduce yourself, where you're calling in from, and then make your comment. Over to you, Jose.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jose Lobo. I am a faculty at Arizona State University in Tempe, Arizona, although at the moment I'm in Stockholm, in Sweden. Thank you, Heba and Olamide, for your talk. And in my question and comment, I'm going to reflect a little bit on the discussions that took place just a few weeks ago in the scoping meeting that occurred for the upcoming special report by the IPCC on climate change and cities. And one of the themes that was discussed in that meeting is that there is a tremendous knowledge gap about what will the effects of climate change that we know is going to happen. The debate is whether it's going to be worse or not, but what will be the effects of climate change on the activities of urban residents? So, for example, I happen to live in a city in Phoenix, Arizona, where at the moment, the absence of shade means that by 2040, it will simply be dangerous to walk. So I was thinking of the urgency of trying to understand how will increasing heat affect walkability? Is it going to make it less likely? Is it going to make it dangerous? That is information that at the moment is not easily available. And with regard to informal settlements, there was a recognition at this meeting, this scoping meeting, that there's a tremendous knowledge gap of what will be the actual consequence. How will climate change be experienced in informal settlements? Not just a generic description of it's going to rain more, it's going to get warmer, just specifically. And that information, to be actionable, has to be reflected in maps. So I just wanted to share that comment and maybe get your sense, Heba and Olamide, of the extent to which you think it will be feasible to try to incorporate it into the mapping you're already engaging in of what would it mean to walk in the ways people now walk, let's say if it's 5 degrees warmer. Anyway, so thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jose. So we have a kind of temporal and future aspect from Jose, and focus on formal settlements. Kirsten, you wanna make a comment, and we'll come back to Heba and Olamide.
Yes, it's. I hope you can hear me, and it's really just a comment, not a question. So, Heba Olamide, thanks for a great talks. It was very interesting for me. I'm Kirsten. I'm working at Highgate at the Climate Action Focus Group, and we are currently developing climate action indicators, so for climate mitigation and climate adaptation. And actually, at the moment, we are focusing on walkability and bikeability index. And yes, what became very apparent is that walkability or unwalkable and unbikeable means completely different things in the global south and the global north. And just a offer maybe to you and others, if you would be interested in a knowledge exchange and maybe some mutual support on developing indicators or index on walkability and bikeability, it would be great, because I think one or a quarter of the population lives in informal settlements, and I think maybe adding on what Jose just said, it's not just the heat making it more dangerous, but also the increasing amount of extreme events and downpouring actually, and how do we reach people if there are no streets, and how do you rescue people by foot or by bike? So so just my 2 cents on that.
Thank you, Kirsten. Before Olamide and Heba go, I'm going to encourage. Great. I was going to say I encourage some mappers to join the conversation and talk about specific data. Ola, once Heba and Olamide have answered it, it's going to be over to you. But Olamide, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sorry, just to finish off what Kirsten was just saying there, or by boat. Some people will have to be using boat because the flood. I mean, already, I just wanted to say that when you're talking about adaptation, already people are experiencing these kind of heavy rainfall, extreme heat conditions. And so I think what Jose was mentioning there is actually really important, that we start kind of thinking about this. And it can be done quite easily, I think, from kind of what Heba is doing and what I'm doing in terms of thinking about these kind of future possibilities, and figuring out, okay, if people are walking this distance now, how can they really be walking that distance? And since we are somewhat mapping, there's an understanding, mapping, we're not necessarily mapping walkability, but we're doing some walkability assessments. How accessible will these areas be? Already we can see where the issues are in terms of, if it rains, this is what happens. And then how can we, then it was another organization or another project, I guess, to be thinking about, okay, if this is what's going to happen, and this is what the data is showing, how can we start to mitigate from these happening, and as you mentioned, Kristen, how can we actually get to people? And then I think there was a question at the beginning on carbon emissions, and thinking about, I think Michael, yes, mentioned about carbon emission and measure, and have we seen any tools for that? So I haven't used any per se. I don't know if Heba has, but we haven't been looking at the direct effect of kind of driving and carbon emissions. But conversation we had with Ola recently with Urban Better, they're looking at they're using a wearable what's it called now? I'm losing my words.
Sensors.
But sensors, yes, that's it. Wearable sensors and going on runs and walks, and then measuring the air quality as they're going on these kind of runs and walks through the city. And they're kind of comparing that with static sensors. Which are already in certain places, but they're not everywhere in Lagos. So that allows them to kind of think of what's happening with the static sensors, and then try to see what's happening with the wearable sensors. And of course, the wearable sensors can then or are being used as like a second case of data, where okay, the static is showing on a Tuesday there's more kind of air quality issues. So they would go out and run on a Tuesday and see, okay, what is the cause, what's happening in that area on a Tuesday, and then they also have that comparison of the wearable data. So maybe that could be something that you could look into as well, Michael. But in terms of measuring the CO2 emission, we haven't done that. Over to you, Heba.
Yes, thank you, Olamide. I think you kind of also answered everything. But just to add, Christian, yeah, I would love to explore like areas of cooperation, especially like mitigation versus adaptation strategies, global north versus global south. We see a lot of yeah. Anyhow, yeah, we can talk a little about this more and yeah, explore them. That's kind of yeah, I would love to do that. And Jose, I think, asked about how climate change affects walkability, and I can give you a little example, right? So in Lusaka, we don't get extreme heats, for instance, as the way Zanzibar gets, and like the humidity here or whatever. But we do get extreme floods and extreme drought. The drought doesn't really affect the urban life except for, like food insecurity and stuff like that, but it doesn't really affect the walkability, let's say. But what really affects the walkability is those extreme rains that make practically walking impossible. So for instance, there is, my tongue is really bad, so I forgot the name, but there is a name for a guy who would, like if you're in an informal settlement and it's raining and you can't walk and you have to go to school, there is a guy who would carry you on his back for like 3 to 5 kwacha and would take you from one place to another. Another thing that is also you can see in informal settlements is something called ZAM caps. So if anyone just write ZAM caps, ZAM cap. It's something that is used within the marketplaces to move goods from one place to another. It's like a barrel. It's practically a walking barrel. And now with the extreme rain, people are using them to move within the informal settlement. So once it starts raining, those people know their jobs and they go out there. You can like take a piggy bag ride on somebody's back to go somewhere for 5 kwacha or get out of your house on a barrel. So these are kind of like the things that you see in front of you, right? That affects the walkability, but also it is maybe part of an NMT strategy, kind of. That is mitigated and completely owned by the people. The government does not interfere in any of this. And this has been happening. I was in Lusaka for 2 years only, but this apparently has been happening for the past 20 years. The floods have been really bad. So yeah, this is the kind of thing that we see affecting urban life and affecting walkability directly, right? And the last thing is Michael asked about the climate aspect of this. I know one of the best work that's been done on walkability and cycling on the continent is the UNEP 2022 report. It's called Walking and Cycling in Africa. And they actually have a little bit of measurements on practically every major city on the continent. So I would go back to that. That being said, I would still kind of, while walking is inherently good, people who are walking for 2.5 hours in Lusaka to get to their work and then not having enough calories to substitute that. And for us to also, so it's like, as we're doing this work, and as I was doing this work personally, I try to also remain critical of this notion of walking is an inherently good thing. It's like, okay, walking for 45 minutes is inherently a good thing, but if you're pregnant and you're a woman and you're on your, I don't know, if you're on your period or something, and you're walking for 2.5 hours to get somewhere, and then you have to work for another 9 hours before you do the 2.5 hours back, because you can't afford 10 kwacha to get on a public bus, then maybe it's not so good. And just remaining critical as we do our work is also like really important to differentiate like the global south kind of special walking situation. Yeah, I hope I answered everything.
Thank you, Heba. Ola, over to you, and then Raja. A challenge to hot colleagues: bring your mapping knowledge to the space. What are the opportunities? What should we be doing to support this kind of work? What could we be doing? So yeah, have a think about that. Ola, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Pete. Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Ola, and I'm with the WNE Hub. I think Heba just kind of touched on the question I wanted to ask, because I was thinking around, in Nigeria, for example, we have like a lot of sun here. So I wanted to like kind of ask, like, how are they looking around walkability and health? Because like sometimes exposure to sun might lead to some problems. So I just wanted to ask around that and try to see if there are ways, you quantify, based on different climates, what walkability would mean. Like if you're in Lagos, for example, maybe you should not walk for like more than 20 minutes or like something like that. So that's what I just wanted to ask. Yeah.
Thanks, Ola. Keep that one in your back pocket. Heba and Olamide and Raja.
Yeah. Thank you, Pete. Yeah, the question is how to address this topic. Because you mentioned that by having this map, we're going to encourage a better policy. And in reality is usually it's not ideal, and it's bitter. In most of the country, at the country level, this topic is not recognized in the national adaptation plan and also in the national mitigation plan, because the topic is segmented. Climate change is separate from the DRR, and in most of the countries, it is categorized as development topics. So by recognizing this, we know how best and effective ways to address this issue, because maybe policymakers do not consider this as a part of the climate topic. It's more of livable environment, livable cities, more a challenge on infrastructure, on development.
Okay, thank you, Raja. So Ola on heat and health, and then Raja on change being non-linear and things being categorized in silos when they should be treated as a system. Olamide, you want to go first?
Sure. So in terms of kind of silo working, I guess that's the truth. Also the same in Lagos or in Nigeria. There are various policies around climate change, but I think one thing that has from my experience, one thing that has been able to kind of bring it together in terms of policy, now not in terms of implementation. So in terms of policy has been the resilience plan. So we have a Lagos resilience plan that has brought quite a lot of, it comes from waste management to walkability to road design, even if it goes quite detailed. However, when it comes to implementation, the ministries, the agencies, they're not talking to each other, even though, I mean, I also actually helped write the resilience plan. So I know that we really made an effort to make a lot of the things quite integrated. So when we talked about flooding, we even had education in there as well, and a variety of different things. And it was really kind of community led. So we also try to find things that are, we also try to find solutions or ways of thinking that were community led, but also not necessarily super expensive, not like we're going to build some large infrastructure project, but thinking about, like, for example, with waste management, with, you know, I'm not going to go into detail, but basically we really try to make it less kind of big thinking, and really kind of how can local people and local implementation happen. But however, the implementation is where, you know, it still gets stuck at this very siloed and very okay, this is just transport, we stick it with transport. This is just waste management, we stick it with, this is education. And so I think that's where we really, well, for a Lagos example, we really have to work hard on trying to really bring these agencies talking and being able to implement things together. And then it goes to budget. So how do we now, you know, make the budget something that isn't going to one project, but going to a variety of projects, and kind of really, you know, spreading that out, and ownership of the project isn't for one agency, but for a variety of agencies. And that, I think, is the real task when it comes to kind of thinking about implementing any project, whether it's a climate resilience or adaptation or infrastructure project and so on. And then Ola, yes, mentioned about heat. So with the walkability assessment, there's actually, and which is why I like the ICDP model, but I think, of course, we need to think about it because every city is different and walkability is different for each area. But the reason I like the ICDP model is actually it covers quite a lot of things. So it even talks about coverage. It talks about kind of, you know, safety. It talks about you know, and it's personal, because you're the one doing the walkability assessment. So it's, how do you feel? Do you feel safe in this environment? You know, and one of the walkability assessments that we did, it was pouring down with rain at the University of Lagos. The students and we still went out. We had to get some, you know, what's it, like anorak things we just bought off the street, and we still went. And of course, you know, it then becomes even more annoying that you're walking with, you know, in this rain, doing this assessment, and they're asking you, oh, do you have coverage? You know, are you able to walk? Is there potholes? You're getting splashed by, you know, cars. You know, is there coverage in the gutter? The whole walkway is completely flooded because, you know, you can't even go through it because you don't even know what is there in the walkway. So you're having to go onto the road. You know, so all these kind of things. Is it a gutter? Is it not? So all these kind of things kind of play a part. And of course, I think there that it doesn't necessarily say, oh, you can only walk for 20 minutes in the sun, but it's that, you know, you could walk longer if you had the, you know, the coverage and so on, or that it wasn't flooded in, you know, or rather than walking with the car. So I think that's what the ITDP assessment does, and I think it's important to be able to get a criteria that is valid for your own climate and your own environment. So yeah, that's it.
Thanks, Olamide. And it looks to me, when we looked at the results slide from your walk, like a lot of the criteria in there are eminently mappable. Like when we talk about the size of blocks, shade and shelter, crosswalks, all that kind of stuff. Heba, I'm going to just go to Atia and Liz, because we're going to have to round up soon. Maybe you could be the first to respond there, and if you want to comment on the others, you can. So Atia, Liz, if you can keep it really brief, that would help me.
Sure, I'll try to. So thank you for the great presentation, and it's been a great conversation. Just quickly to my point. So like I am speaking from India, and then we have a smart cities project, and we have a government ministry that works on these projects, but somehow the smart cities kind of meant more of flyovers, more of urban infrastructure, but like, I think it didn't end up being walkable as such. But my question is specifically when we talk about walkability. So we have excellent urban infrastructure. We have public communication, which has improved drastically and is kind of really excellent. But then do you, in your planning, do you also consider aspects like, for example, I am speaking from Delhi, so that's the national capital. The streets are walkable, but can women walk? Like, I think I can't walk after sunset. Like, do you also look into parameters like this? Specifically for women, do you work with such stakeholders? Also looking at people who are differently abled, like those kind of infrastructure. And particularly related to women, because I remember in 2018, I was working with Safety Pin, an organization where, because I think the government forgot that women are 49% of the population here. So we worked with that NGO to map all the places which had street lights in Delhi. And it really helped. Places where they can venture out at night after sunset, whatever. So yeah, just keeping it short. Yeah, over to you.
Liz, you got 30 seconds.
Okay, well, thank you all so much. Such an interesting conversation. I wanted to ask about kind of the comment that Raja made, and you were commenting on about like the intersection between, or kind of like how can government agencies and all of the different partners and groups working within one community, one country, one region kind of like work better together. And I wanted to ask kind of and challenge us to think about how can open data make that process more effective, more efficient. And I mean, if we had time, I'd love to get into some ideas for how we could do that. But I think to me, that's where we at HOT are coming from. It's like the map. How can the map actually enable that collaboration and kind of effectiveness, so we're not all struggling on our own, but we're working better together?
Thank you, Liz. So Heba, I'm going to have you close out the formal session. I want to remind people, we're going to leave the room open for half an hour. Heba and Olamide, are you able to stay for the half an hour, or do you need to shoot off? Olamide, yes. Heba, I can't see you, but thumb up or thumb down would be helpful. So we can follow up on some of these questions afterwards, but over to you, Heba, for the final comment.
Yeah, if miraculously my internet is still going, I'm just gonna stay here as long as I can. But yeah, so I'll start with Atiya's question, and I think like my biggest problem, or like I actually have PTSD from flyovers would go nowhere all over the continent, and to hear that there are more flyovers going nowhere in Indian smart cities, yeah, is really it's really unfortunate. In my case in Lusaka, we did not work with a lot of differently abled individuals, and this is one of the kind of drawbacks that we had at the last thing. But kind of our conclusion is like the streets are not even made for people who are completely well abled and can walk, and the conclusion is that like if you have different abilities, the streets are not made for you practically. But this is a drawback from the research. We didn't also have a huge women-focused thing. So we discussed this in the kind of co-creation workshop at the beginning, and should not we? And practically the feedback always came that streets start getting dangerous for women in Lusaka after 12-ish, where like more like crime starts happening, or drunk driving, or even people being drunk in the streets. But yeah, in the morning, it's a bit it's not India, or it's not North Africa, where it's it's a bit more dangerous, I would say, for women. So we didn't have a huge women focus, but actually I would say 2/3 of all of our walkers were actually women. So we actually got to hear their opinions more than men, which is something
Heba, I'm going to interrupt just because I can see people starting to drop off because they will have to go to other things. And before they do, I would love for everyone just to say a huge thank you to Heba and Olamide as we close the kind of formal part of this. So feel free to turn your microphones on and clap, whoop, cheer, whatever
Thank
you try to do.
Yeah, thank
Thank you
you.
so much, Heba and Olamide, and I'll stop the live stream, but we'll continue to record. So if anyone's leaving
Thank
and
you.
wants to hear the rest of the conversation, that'll be available. Yeah, thanks all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Let me just work out how to stop the live stream. Okay, stop streaming. Okay, so you know we are